The recent developments in the US-Cuba relations have been marked by a series of twists and turns, reflecting the changing political dynamics in both countries. Under President Barack Obama, the United States and Cuba took unprecedented steps to normalize their bilateral relations, which had been frozen for more than half a century. In 2014, Obama and Raul Castro announced that they would restore diplomatic ties and expand travel and trade between the two countries. In 2015, they reopened their respective embassies in Havana and Washington. In 2016, Obama became the first sitting U.S. president to visit Cuba since 1928, and he also abstained from voting against a UN resolution condemning the U.S. embargo on Cuba, signaling a possible end to the long-standing policy of isolation. However, Obama's successor, Donald Trump, reversed course and adopted a hardline stance against Cuba. He rolled back many of Obama's reforms and imposed new sanctions on the island, citing its human rights violations and its support for Venezuela's socialist government. He also reinstated Cuba on the state sponsors of terrorism list, a move that was widely criticized by experts and allies as politically motivated and counterproductive. Trump's measures were welcomed by some Cuban-Americans who opposed any engagement with the communist regime, but they also hurt the Cuban people who suffered from shortages of food, medicine, and fuel amid the COVID-19 pandemic. President Joe Biden came into office with a promise to return to Obama's policy of engagement with Cuba, but he has been slow to act on it. He has faced pressure from both sides of the political spectrum. Some Democrats and human rights groups have urged him to lift the sanctions and resume dialogue with Havana, while some Republicans and Cuban-American lawmakers have warned him not to appease the dictatorship. Biden has also been confronted with a new challenge: the unprecedented wave of protests that erupted across Cuba in July 2021, sparked by the economic crisis, the pandemic, and the lack of freedom. The Cuban government responded with a violent crackdown on the demonstrators, arresting hundreds of activists and journalists. Biden has expressed his solidarity with the Cuban people and condemned the repression by the Cuban authorities. He has also eased some restrictions on remittances and humanitarian aid to Cuba, but he has not lifted the embargo or removed Cuba from the terrorism list. He has said that he is reviewing his policy towards Cuba and that he will make changes only if they benefit the Cuban people and advance U.S. interests. He has also called for international pressure on Cuba to respect human rights and initiate democratic reforms. The future of U.S.-Cuba relations remains uncertain and dependent on many factors, such as the political will of both governments, the public opinion of both peoples, and the regional and global context. The normalization process initiated by Obama and Castro was seen as a historic opportunity to end decades of hostility and mistrust, but it was interrupted by Trump's hostility and Biden's hesitation. The recent protests in Cuba have shown that there is a strong demand for change on the island, but also that there is a deep divide between those who support the revolution and those who oppose it. The United States faces a dilemma: how to balance its values of democracy and human rights with its interests of security and stability in its backyard. The U.S. embargo on Cuba has been in place for 60 years, and it has had a devastating impact on the Cuban people, especially in terms of economic hardship, humanitarian crisis, and social unrest. The embargo affects every aspect of life on the island. It bans all trade, tourism, remittances, and technology transfers between the U.S. and Cuba. It also imposes sanctions and penalties on Cuba's allies and investors, isolating the country from the rest of the world. The UN estimates that the embargo has cost Cuba over $130 billion in damages, which is equivalent to more than 6 times its annual GDP. The embargo has also hindered Cuba's access to food, medicine, fuel, and other essential goods and services.